Welcome to A Language I Love Is, a podcast all about languages, linguistics, and love. I'm your host, Danny, and for this episode I went along to Charles University in Prague to join Dr Radek Šimík and dive into the linguistics of the local language, Czech. I'm here currently at Charles University, and I'm very much looking forward to speaking to Dr. Radek Šimík. Here in Charles University, we're actually in a very, very cool phonetics recording studio, so the sound quality is going to be particularly good for this episode, I like to think. And Radek has very kindly invited me here to talk about one particular language that he knows very well, it's fair to say, and I also think has a particular fondness for. So, Radek, how are you doing today? How are you feeling?
Thank you very much, Danny, for inviting me to the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been a keen listener to the podcast, and I'm very happy to be in an interview with you as well.
You know the format, but for new-time listeners of this podcast, I think I should run through what the point of A Language I Love Is. Essentially, this is a chance for you, the listener, to get to know one particular language and one particular person who loves this language. Today, it's Radek. And this is going to happen through 4 parts and 3 questions. After the first part, which is building up a little bit of a language profile, introducing this language, what it is, where you can find its speakers, etc., we'll then move on to some questions that invite Radek to share his relationship to this language, what he likes about it, and something that he wants the people at home to know about. So, first things first, let's answer the main question. What is a language that you love and would like to talk about with us today?
A language I love is Czech.
Excellent. Fair to say, you know this language quite well. You have a long-term relationship with this language. We should say first and foremost, you are a native speaker of Czech, but you're also a linguist, so you work on this language. Let's set the scene in terms of Czech. Where in the world can you find speakers of the Czech language?
The Czech language is spoken in the Czech Republic, which is since relatively recently also officially called Czechia, which is a word I do like. We have a Czech version of that as well, which is Česko. So Czech is spoken in Czechia. It's a country, it's a republic that you can find just east to Germany. It's in Central Europe. The people that live in Czechia, there are about 10 million of them. That constitutes also most of the speakers. There are some speakers outside of Czechia. For example, in Romania, there's an area where there's still people who left the Czech lands a couple of hundred years ago. I don't know exactly when, but they still live there. There are a couple of villages. It's called Banat, the area. And that's where Czech is spoken as well. And I bet there are other places outside of Czechia where Czech is spoken too, although I have to say, compared to some other countries, Czech people are really mostly located in Czechia.
That's a really nice introduction in terms of the geography where you tend to find these people. It's not a global language, Czech. It's not a language where you have a large diaspora of people spread across the world. I believe that there are large communities of Czech heritage, Czech ancestry in America, for example. I think also in Chicago and Texas. But how much the language is for them a daily language, I think not so much. Not today.
Really,
no.
There are some traditions that are still being kept in a semi-artificial mode, as far as I know and what I've seen. But I'm doubtful about Czech being their daily language, indeed.
Understood. So let's then turn to a little bit about the history of the Czech language. We don't need to go too much into this story, but essentially, could you unpack what is the genealogy of the Czech language? When I say genealogy, where does it come from? What are the perhaps earlier stages of this language that we know of? And what might be its sister languages within Europe?
Czech is a Slavic language. More particularly, it is a West Slavic language. So Slavic languages are divided into 3 larger groups, into West Slavic languages, East Slavic, and South Slavic. So Czech is a West Slavic language together with Polish, Slovak, and Sorbian, of which there are 2 versions, 2 dialects, or maybe 2 languages, Upper Sorbian and Lower Sorbian. So those are the West Slavic languages. And what I find interesting is that Czech has a sister language, which is Slovak. And Slovak and Czech are mutually intelligible. So now when you think about one of the classical definitions of what a language is, two dialects or two versions of a language are called a language if they are essentially mutually not intelligible. So from this perspective, Czech and Slovak should actually be considered two dialects of a single language because they are mutually intelligible, and there is some nice research on that from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, showing that indeed among the West Slavic languages, Czech and Slovak are the two that are the most mutually intelligible languages. Also, Czech and Slovak have shared some or a good part of history. So there's a history in the 20th century where Czechia and Slovakia were in a single country called Czechoslovakia, where people were exposed to both languages to a similar extent in media, for example. So it was that, of course, supported the mutual intelligibility. But now, having kids who have grown up only in Czechia, no longer in Slovakia, I can see that they also understand Slovak, even though there are problems with understanding that.
I see.
Now, where Czech comes from, so the assumption is that Proto-Slavic, so the language that is the ancestor of all the Slavic languages, goes back to around the 5th, maybe 6th century AD. Since then, they started splitting into these different groups. And when it comes to Czech, we have a record of written Czech going back to about the 11th century. This is what would be called Old Czech. We also have younger version of Czech, which we would call Middle Czech. And then we have the newer Czech that is a relatively recent phenomenon. And Czech is a language that for quite a long time of its history was not written to a great extent because Czechia was for many centuries part of Austria. And the main written language in those times was German. So only in the 19th century there was what we call the national revival, something happening across Europe, of course not only here, where people started preparing or started building up Czech as a literary language, again, as a language of education. So this is what started in the 19th century, and curiously enough, what they took as the model for this new written, formal, high standards Czech language is a translation of a Bible into Czech from the 16th century called Bible Kralická. So curiously enough, in the 19th century, a new standard of Czech was created that was hundreds of years old. Which created a little bit of a diglossia, if you wish, in the sense that we have a formal language, formal Czech language, which is kind of old. And then we have the vernacular, the colloquial language, which has incorporated since the time a lot of especially phonetic and morphological changes, of course lexical ones as well. But this diglossia is definitely it's too much to say it's a diglossia. It's these two variants of the language, the standard Czech and the colloquial Czech, are actually very close to each other, I would think.
If I may, definitely, if I can come in. As a learner, I should say, as someone who's done his absolute best to get proficient with Czech, it's not so serious. It's really not a case that you might have in other countries where the prestige language feels completely alien. They're definitely like two ends of a continuum, two ends of an arc. But nonetheless, it is a curious situation that has developed. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, of course, this idea of the deliberate creation of a written standard, which is based on the Kralice Bible. This has created a strange tension in the modern-day Czech Republic. I feel that you have this standard language that everybody should know, and then once you know it, then you cannot use it. That's what it feels like to me as well as a learner. I have to go through the standard language. I have to say dobrý den rather than dobrej, and I have to say osum rather than vosum. But once I know it, then I can drop it, which is a curious situation, I think, for a language. That brings me to ask a little bit about the dialectal situations, because why is the language of the Kralice Bible different? Is it because it's just simply older, or is it from another kind of Czech based on geography? If you learn standard Czech as a non-native speaker of Czech, you might not be aware that there is actually quite a lot of dialectal variation in this country, right? It's something that I only pick up occasionally. So is there considerable variation in this country according to geography?
There definitely is variation. There are dialects that as far as I can judge, are still alive, especially in some areas of Czechia. Czechia has three main parts, three main large regions. One is called Bohemia, which is in the west. One is called Moravia, which is in the east. In the northeast, we can find Silesia as well. The most dialectal variation you can find in the east, so in Moravia and Silesia. In Moravia, there are a couple of quite distinct dialects with differences, especially in phonology. And in Bohemia, in the west, the variation is not that great, but there are definitely also dialects over there. The current colloquial standard is based on what is spoken. Like the most prestigious variant of colloquial Czech would be the Central Bohemian variant of Czech, which is spoken in Prague and around Prague. And this is something that has been penetrating media as well. So you can hear this version of colloquial Czech in media already, in fairly standard mainstream media, not in like the official Czech TV, which would correspond to something like BBC. They are still very careful and cautious there, but in privately owned media that are fairly mainstream, you can already hear colloquial Czech as well. And that would be the colloquial Czech that you hear here in Prague and around Prague. It would be very strange if you took like a general Moravian, if you wish, if there is such a thing. If you took a general Moravian and started speaking that in media, in state media, then you definitely and instantly can hear that the person who is speaking a dialect. So there is this difference in perception of the dialects, where the Bohemian dialects are considered more neutral, standard, penetrating media. The Moravian dialects are still looked upon as real dialects, with unfortunately also with the socio-linguistic associations with it, like the people are less educated and all these things, which are of course not true.
But that's curious that you mentioned that Moravia has these one or two very recognizable dialects that are Moravian. Moravia geographically is further south and it's further east. That runs up to the border with Slovakia. Can I presume, therefore, that Moravian Czech is closer to Slovak? Is that fair to say?
That is definitely fair to say, yeah. There is a big divide between Moravian dialects and Slovak, but it is definitely true that East Moravian dialects especially are much closer to Slovak than, for example, the Bohemian dialects.
Understood. And this is something that we've touched upon previously on this podcast, the consequences of borders. Borders have an effect because they shape people's lives. Perhaps prior to the establishment of these states and these it's a very modern concept to have these hard and fast borders where you belong here and you don't belong there. And perhaps prior to this modern state, it would have been a bit more fluid, but the borders do shape the language today, and especially now that that is now a separate country, has separated from Slovakia. I'm just curious though, would you think therefore that since the separation of Slovakia from the Czechs, do you think that knowledge of Slovak is actually getting worse from generation to generation? Would you say that, for example, your parents would understand Slovak much better than you, and you would understand it much better than your children? Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, even though I was born in the 80s, at the beginning of the 80s, and Czechoslovakia split in 93. So I was 11 years old. I had enough input of Slovak to understand it to, I would say, more than 95%. I do think that my parents know Slovak a little better, especially the passive Slovak, so especially some words that are different in Slovak than in Czech. And I do think that my kids understand it worse than I do, because the kids might not have a problem only with words that are different, and that is definitely something that is difficult in its own right, but they also might have a problem with the phonological part. So there are some very systematic differences in the phonology that distinguish the two languages. And if you learn them, if you get used to them, then you can understand Slovak very easily. This is something that my kids haven't been exposed to. very much. So this is something that is difficult for them and that they would have to learn in order to understand Slovak better.
But if, for example, when they're a little bit older, if they were to spend a week in Bratislava or in Slovakia, it would be a kind of case of adjusting their ears, squinting your ears, I like to say, and you start to see the systematic connections. Well, let's explore them. What are the differences between Czech and Slovak, or Czech and other languages? What are the very salient, very Czech features of the language?
So, in terms of the sound system of the language, Czech has gone the furthest of all the Slavic languages in losing the distinction between non-palatalized and palatalized versions of consonants. So, for example, if you look at Russian still has a palatalized version of the sound P, which is something that Czech doesn't even hear. We don't have a distinction between what you could call hard P and soft P or something like that, or palatal P. So Czech lost this distinction quite a bit, to a great extent. It kept it in some interesting corners of the sound system. One such interesting corner is the sound for R, which is actually mostly pronounced just with a tap, so it's R. So it's at the beginning of my name, of my first name. It's Radek, usually just done with a single tap, not with Radek. If you do that, it sounds foreign. It sounds like probably a Spanish person is trying to pronounce your name. And what used to be a palatal version of R, so you could call a soft R, became in modern Czech a completely distinct sound, which sounds as R. Okay, so we have now the distinction between R and R. So we have the word rád, which means glad, and you have a word řád, which means order. And these two are distinct, so it's a phonological distinction. So this is something that we have in Czech, and this is something that the Slovaks don't have. So they don't have R, they would still have just R.
But this is unique. I believe that this sound is perhaps globally unique. This R sound is a much celebrated feature of Czech. It's a much feared feature of Czech as well among learners. But I do believe at least that it is globally almost unique, if not unique. Every now and then I see the claim come up that it's unique, and this is immediately followed by a counterclaim, so I've lost track of whether this is true or not. I believe at least that Polish used to have it, but it's lost it. It's just become ż in Polish. Exactly. It makes sense. Polish and Czech have emerged from the same source, so the sounds developed in similar ways, but Polish has gone a little bit further. Czech, possibly alone among the world's languages today, has ż, which is much feared among learners. I'm very pleased that I've managed to acquire it over the years as well. It does show a certain amount of investment in the language and the country, I like to think as well. But there are some other features of Czech that I think are actually quite nice and quite helpful for learners. One thing is that Czech has a very rigid stress placement. It's always the first syllable.
Yes.
That interests me because you might think, oh, that's a very rigid rule. How am I ever going to learn it? Well, to an English speaker, it is difficult. It does take time to get used to. But I will say one thing. It makes Czech words very clear, acoustically perceptible. So say, for example, you listen to French. I think we've all had this experience of French as non-native speakers. It just sounds like one long stream of sounds. It's difficult. I really struggle with spoken French. In Czech, when every word starts with the stressed syllable, you can tell when every word begins. That's very helpful as well. Yes. So I mention this because I think it's linguistically true and interesting, but also because just to tip the balance in terms of Czech's pretty terrible reputation as a language that people should try to learn. I'll just say that in Czech's favour. I feel that we're in a very good place now vis-a-vis the Czech language. We've discussed a little bit about its geography, a little bit about its dialects, where you can find speakers of this language. But I want to turn away now from talking about Czech in general to talking about one person who has a pretty intimate relationship with this language, which is, of course, yourself, Radek. Could you just tell us, what is your story with the Czech language? I think the first part of this story will be fairly obvious, but just talk us through it. How did you come to know Czech? And also, what is its relevance to your life today?
Czech is my mother tongue, so I bathed in Czech since my childhood. It is the language that I know best still, even though I lived 13 years abroad. I lived in the Netherlands and in Germany, where I spoke most of the time other languages than Czech, and I did feel some traces of language attrition going on in myself. But still, Czech is still the language that I know the most. I guess maybe that I love the most as well, even though being a linguist, and you know it probably yourself, it is difficult to love a single language if you're a linguist, because you acquire a love for all the languages that you study. So I always liked language in general. Language for me, also from elementary school and secondary school, was mostly Czech, and of course then foreign languages as well. But I was one of the weirdos that did like actually Czech lessons at school, not for the reason of reading interesting books, but for doing language analysis, morphological and syntactic. And I did like it back then, and I still like it. This is also actually what I ended up doing. I had a very vague idea of what linguistics is when I was in my secondary school. I had a sense that I would like to study it. I actually was applying for general linguistics, which I didn't get into for a master's studies back in the day. What I did start studying was the Czech language and English language, or Czech philology and English philology in Olomouc. And this is how I started doing linguistics. Already at the admission exams in Olomouc, the teachers there would ask me what I wanted to do, why I wanted to come and study language. And I was probably one of the few people who would say, actually, I find the language itself interesting, not so much the literature. And I was worried that that would be the wrong answer, but it ended up being the right one because they took me.
Yep.
And I concentrated on language mostly. I had to sit through the literature classes. I did acquire some taste for literature, so I had the opportunity to read a lot of interesting books, both in Czech and in English. But language really was what I loved most, and I really enjoyed syntax. And this is what brought me to do some research on syntax during my master's studies. I did some research on relative clauses, and that then in turn brought me to the Netherlands, to Groningen, where I had the opportunity to study under the supervision of Mark de Vries, who was one of the, and still is, one of the major leading experts on the syntax of relative clauses. Which is what I wanted to study and what I wanted to write my dissertation on. My initial plan was actually to write about Czech mostly, because the way I approached linguistics back then was just to quite some extent via my own intuition about how Czech works. So the classical, if you wish, the classical armchair method. I gradually started looking into other languages as well, finding out that there is some fun, and actually quite some fun, in looking at the comparative perspective, comparing Czech to other languages. I ended up having in my dissertation a sample of about 20 languages, I think, so it was also to some extent typological work. I gradually started being interested more and more in semantics as well. So now I'm something between a syntactician and semanticist. I also, especially when I was doing my postdoc at Potsdam University, together with Gisbert Vancelo and others like Marta Wierzba, who was a student back then, I started studying or I started using more rigorous methods of approaching language. We started doing experiments on syntax and semantics. And this is what I keep doing now as well. Here in Prague, where I work now, where I've worked for the past 4 years, in the Institute of Czech Language and Theory of Communication, many of my colleagues are not that much interested in the formal and structural aspects of Czech or of other languages. They're interested in psycholinguistics, for example, or in sociolinguistic aspects of Czech. And by sharing, at least to some extent, the methodological basics, the methodological aspects of the work, we can communicate much better. So I find nice collaborations here with people working in language acquisition, for example. So recently we were looking at how Czech children acquire WH words. WH words are words that are used in interrogative sentences, in questions, to ask a question like which, where, who, what. The interesting thing about that is that these words can be used not just for the interrogative purpose, not just for questions, but also for expressing other constructions like relative clauses, and then different types of relative clauses, so-called headed relative clauses, which have a nominal head, like the man who I met. Also free relative clauses. An example would be, I like what you said. And correlative clauses, or so-called unconditionals. Wherever you go, I will go with you, for example. So all these constructions are constructions where you use WH words. And what we looked at in this research was how Czech children acquire this multifunctionality of the WH words. Where do they start? Where do they start learning these WH words? And where do they end? And why in this order, for example?
Bringing the conversation now back to Czech, what is one thing that you really love about the Czech language? I know this is difficult for a native speaker. It's just what you do. It's the language that you know best as well. But you have said already that you are a little bit of an armchair linguist. Armchair linguist is I'm not sure whether to say if it's a pejorative term or not, but essentially it's a linguist who works with their own language and does a lot of introspection, right? And you have done this with Czech. So amidst that introspection, is there one thing that you've recognized with this language that you think, oh, this is neat, this is pretty cool?
One particular feature of Czech that I thought would be interesting to mention is that Czech is one of the very few languages, at least as far as I know, and Slovak does have it as well, but then Czech and Slovak, as we already mentioned in the beginning, are very close to each other anyways. But Czech has this very interesting use of the infinitive form. The infinitive form would be in English something that you would get under verbs like want, for example. I want to go home. So the to go is the infinitival form. This is also something that we have in Czech. It will not be expressed by a particle or whatever that piece of word is, this t, but it would be expressed by a suffix, by a grammatical suffix on the verb. And the infinitive has many different uses in the Czech language. And one particular use is, I think, or at least as far as I know so far, unique among the languages, probably definitely among the European languages. So if you say in English something like, Mary needs to praise somebody, right? Then it means that Mary is in need of something. And what she is in need of something is that she would be the one praising somebody. In Czech, what you can say, or you can say that in English too, Mary needs to praise. It sounds a little bit awkward, I guess, but it would still mean the same, that Mary would be the one who is active in the praising. And there is no other way. Now, if you translate this sentence into Czech, which would sound, Marie potřebuje pochválit. Marie is the Mary, potřebuje, needs, pochválit, praise, in the infinitive form. So literally translated, Mary needs to praise. This sentence is ambiguous. It can either mean the thing that it means in English, Mary needs to praise, but it can also mean that Mary needs to be praised. Okay? So Mary, the subject of the sentence, not only can it be the agent, the active person in praising, but it can also be the person who is being praised in this case. In other words, so for people who are a little bit well-versed or a little knowledgeable in linguistics, this is what you would get with passives. So Mary is praised or is being praised. In order to form a passive, you usually need a certain piece of morphology and syntax. So this is what you do in English. If you say Mary is praised, then you use the passive form of the verb, praised, and usually you also use an auxiliary like is praised. Now in this particular case in Czech that I just discussed, you can see that there is no particular piece of morphology that would tell you that the infinitival form of praise, pochválit, is actually passive. So it can be interpreted both as passive and as active. And this is, as far as I know, a unique property of Czech and probably Slovak. It's interesting that even other languages, other Slavic languages, don't have this feature. So they only can interpret the infinitives in these contexts as active, just as in English, for example. So I thought this would be an interesting thing to mention, because it is something that you don't get to learn in Czech classes, and you can be a little confused when you hear a sentence like Honza chce pomoct. Honza wants to help. And it means Honza wants to be helped. So Honza needs help, in other words.
Is this ambiguity, I mean, is it a problem, do you think? The fact that you can't tell in these cases, the fact that you can't tell, are they the one praising or the one being praised, the one helping or the one being helped? Is it actually confusing, or is it beneficial, actually? Could it somehow be useful to you as a speaker of Czech?
I'm not sure if it can be useful. As a case of ambiguity, it can be always a source of misunderstanding. Of course, you will find it in particular contexts where you can fill in by some other types of information than syntax and morphology. You can fill in this information that disambiguates the final or the resulting sentence, and it's clear whether it's meant in the passive or in the active sense. But it can be an interesting source of jokes as well. So the other day, my son came up to me and said, "Chceš říct vtip?" which literally translated means, "Do you want to say a joke?" It's a strange thing to ask in English, but it's a very natural thing to ask in Czech, because it can be interpreted as, "Do you want to be told a joke?" Right? It can be interpreted as a passive. Now, I say, "Yeah, sure." And my son says, "So please do."
Amazing.
So, of course, the sentence in and of itself is ambiguous. Do you want to tell a joke in Czech can mean, do you want to say a joke? Do you want to tell a joke? Or it can mean, do you want to be told a joke? And of course, the most probable reading of this sentence is, do you want to be told a joke? I want to tell you a joke.
Yes.
So that's the joke in itself, in a way, because then if you say, "So go ahead, tell me a joke," you suddenly make use of this other latent interpretation that is present in the sentence.
Like the true son of a linguist, he's providing examples of this construction for you and this ambiguity. Fantastic, I love it. Does it have a name, this construction or this phenomenon?
There doesn't happen to be much literature on this. It's a relatively marginal phenomenon in terms of how much it has been studied, also because infinitive has been studied a lot in Czech, and there are other more prominent uses of the infinitive. So in this case, me and a colleague of mine who works in the Netherlands, Jakub Dotlačil, back in the day we wrote a paper about this particular construction, and we called it the retroactive infinitive. So this is the term that some people have used for this, which in fact was first used for the so-called tough constructions, like John is easy to please, by Otto Jespersen.
So, for the third and final question, as is always the case, I'd like to ask, is there one thing that you would like to leave the audience with at the end of this episode? Is there one feature of Czech that you think, this is important, this is noteworthy, this is something that people just may not appreciate about this language here in the heart of Europe?
So, I think this is maybe yet another interesting thing about Czech that we haven't mentioned yet. Definitely, is that Czech has had a long history with German. I already mentioned that the Czech region, Czechia, used to be part of Austria for a couple of hundred years. This has left a strong impact on Czech. And actually also there is a strong impact of Czech on German, especially in the Austrian region, so it goes both ways. And there are some really interesting things that Czech people, when they start learning German, or when they get maybe a little more proficient in German, they start to realize that there are these very interesting commonalities between Czech and German that come as a surprise in a way. One such area that I find fascinating, and I know that other Czech people who learn German or speak German find really interesting, is that Czech is, just like German, is a language that has a lot of verbs with prefixes. And the fascinating thing is that there are some verbs that where the combination of the prefix and the verb puts together a new meaning that is not transparent, that you can't just derive from the meanings of the prefix and the verb, but where the meanings of the exact same prefix plus verb is the same in Czech and in German. One such example would be the verb for to imagine. If you want to imagine something, then how you would do it in German is that you say vorstellen. So vorstellen would be literally translated into English as for stand, where stand is in the dynamic meaning, so put something somewhere, stand something somewhere. The way you do it in Czech is just exactly the same. You say představit. Před is the prefix, means for, before, in front, and stavit means to stand, to put something somewhere. Essentially, Czech and German build on the same metaphor in order to create this meaning of imagining something in the sense of putting something in front of you or yourself in order to imagine it. Now, it's quite plausible that this verb, představit, is a calque from German. That means it is very probably just translated piece by piece from German. Another such interesting example would be, there are a lot of them with the prefix před, for. Another such one would be přednést or přednášet, which would be in German vortragen, which means to present or give a lecture. But literally, if you look at it, then you see that it's for and then carry. Now, these two, you would probably never guess that this, putting these two words together, the prefix and the verb, would give you the meaning of give a lecture. But that happens to be exactly the same thing that you do in Czech, for carry. So this connection between Czech and German, I really find fascinating. It's interesting to see that not all the cases of these combinations of prefixes and verb stems that are the same in German and in Czech are actually translations from German to Czech, because some of them, at least, might actually be translations from Latin to both German and to Czech, right? So these would be cases that use the prefix under, something like unterschreiben, literally under write. In Czech would be podepsat, again literally under write. And that means to sign. And that comes from the Latin, and you can do it probably better than I can.
Subscribere. Yeah, as in subscription in English.
Exactly.
Subscription, yeah.
Exactly.
So there's a third influence
Precisely.
in the story of this language
Precisely.
as well. Yeah.
And very probably this is an aerial effect. All these languages that were in a very rich contact with each other, Czech and German, but then both Czech and German with Latin, they have influenced each other, Latin has influenced German and Czech, and German has influenced Czech, and Czech has influenced German. So this whole connection makes it actually pretty hard to find out where the source is sometimes, and where the point of the borrowing is, or where the translation is.
That's fair. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I think that's very sensible to say we can't know for certain where these constructions are first coming from. I will only say, though, that they are enormously useful. In my experience as a learner of this language, German has been the number one language that I have relied on. I don't say that publicly because I have to explain myself. I don't mean to say that somehow Czech is German. I don't mean that at all. But the connections are there. They're invisible. Mm-hmm. We're getting down to a kind of structural level. If you were just to take those two words, something like vorstellen and představit, you would see no connection, but you need to look at the structure. And then all of a sudden, the links appear, and they're all out there to be used. So yeah, great point to end on as well. And I think there's a real practical benefit then to this idea of these connections, whatever their origin, spreading across Central European languages. Fantastic. Okay, well, let's leave it there. I think we must. Last thing I really have to say is just thank you so much, Radek. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thank you for having me here in Charles. It's been a pleasure to visit the university and spend time here. So yeah, just thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me.
For a final fun fact from me, let's talk about nasal vowels. Czech once had two nasal vowels, e and o. They were lost from the language at an early point in time, before our oldest sources for the language, but we can tell that they were there by comparing cognate words in related languages. Over the border in Polish, for instance, we still find nasal vowels and nasal sounds in places where Czech has lost them. While the Polish for a row or an order of things is rząd, with a nasal sound, Czech simply has rad. Yet these two nasal sounds must have still been present in Czech in at least the 10th century, since this is how the name of a famous saintly duke, known to Czechs now as Václav, got borrowed into Latin, and later English, as Wenceslas. So, that's all for this episode of A Language I Love Is. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do give the show a rating and recommend it widely to help share the linguistic love. Every bit of support helps. Thanks must go to my guest today, Radek, and to you, dear listener, for listening. Till the next time then, bye-bye.